Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time, we completed the Lightning Temple, which finishes off the set of all 4 regional phenomena. Today we're heading into Hyrule Castle, but before we get into that, as usual I have to offer my obligatory spoiler warning. We're getting into major story moments in the game here, and nothing is off the table for discussion so long as I feel it relates to the dungeon featured here. So if you haven't yet finished this portion of the game, or you are just avoiding spoilers, then go ahead and save this video into your watch later list, and come back after completing this quest. With that out of the way, let's hop into things. Initially, I was unsure how I was going to go about covering the rest of the game. The 4 main temples are pretty cut and dry as dungeons that I could make individual videos on, but from here on out, things start looking a little bit muddy. My plan was not to cover Hyrule Castle in its own video until recently. Instead, I intended to relegate it to the pre-dungeon section of the Construct Factory and Spirit Temple video. However, after playing through this section to gather footage, glossing over it like that just didn't feel right. Before anybody complains, the subject of what counts as a dungeon is one that I've talked a lot about in prior videos, and based on the previous rules I've set out for myself in the past, the castle does check off more boxes than those it doesn't. Besides, whether a dungeon is actually good or bad is not really a valid argument for if it even counts as a dungeon to begin with. It is a point I see a lot of people cite. They say that things they don't like don't count because they aren't good. I'm sorry, but that is silly, childish logic. I don't like the Ice Palace in A Link to the Past, but it is without a doubt a dungeon. Lots of people don't like Ocarina of Time's Water Temple, but is anybody really going to take the stance that it isn't a dungeon? So maybe you didn't like the dungeons in this game. That's fine, you don't have to. They're still dungeons though. Fight me. Anyways, this place has a dedicated dungeon map, objectives, a boss fight that rewards us with a heart container. It is a dungeon, but we'll circle back to whether it is actually good in a moment. At this point, I usually talk about dungeon order. Well, there is really no debate on things or polls needed this time around. While the castle can be entered and explored before this point, I certainly have done it on all 3 of my playthroughs, the dungeon scenario cannot be completed before having done the 4 main dungeons and awakening the new sages first. Based on that, and the dialogue that happens before and after this dungeon, there's no question to me that this dungeon is meant to sit squarely in the 5th spot. After completing the 4 temples, it'll be suggested that we report back to Lookout Landing. Upon talking to Purah, a cutscene will trigger which spurs us over to investigate sightings of Princess Zelda. From here, it is up to you as far as how to get there. The castle isn't far, but it is suspended in the air, so it isn't simply a matter of walking up to it like in Breath of the Wild. Boliara will suggest launching from the Skyview Tower, which is a pretty feasible method provided you have the stamina, but that is far from the only means of transport in this game. So yeah, this is pretty light on pre-dungeon stuff. Really, all you've got to do once the quest is initiated is get there, and how you do it is up to you. So with all of that out of the way, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome back to Hyrule Castle. There's a bit to talk about here, so a few things I want to get out of the way first. To start with, look at this map from Breath of the Wild. I hated it. I can't read this map. Now, look at the map we got in Tears of the Kingdom. You are beautiful. I can see actual rooms and where they are. Thank you for being you, you beautiful thing. Anyways, I usually would also talk about things like architecture at this point in the video, but I'm going to skip that this time, simply because it is all quite literally stuff I've talked about before. So hey, if you want to listen to me talk about that, go ahead and watch this video on Breath of the Wild's version of the castle, which I did as a collaboration with the lovely Triforce Trends. I'd appreciate it. The atmosphere here is overall pretty similar to how it was in Breath of the Wild as well, but without the twilight lighting that always kicked in near the sanctum in that game, and the malice particles, which are swapped out for gloom, are toned down quite a bit. That said, the place still feels distinctly dangerous, but not as overwhelmingly so as Breath of the Wild's version of the castle. The lack of guardians may be a big contributing factor there, but heading into the castle this time, I can't help but somehow feel more prepared. As always, I've got to talk about the music. It's hard not to compare the music to its Breath of the Wild counterpart. That was one of my favorite pieces of music in that game. This version of the castle theme takes some cues from that piece. It's particularly noticeable in the theme's intro, and mixes in elements from the classic Hyrule Castle theme that debuted back in A Link to the Past. It's not one-to-one, but it's definitely meant to evoke that. It's not quite as bombastic as the Breath of the Wild castle themes, but it also isn't the game's finale anymore, so that choice makes sense. There is a trade-off though. In Breath of the Wild, we actually had two versions of the castle theme, an interior theme and an exterior theme. This time, there are still two themes, but it is instead one for the castle grounds down below and one for the castle in the sky, meaning only one of these themes is used for the actual dungeon part of the castle. I'm okay with that. The piece is actually pretty nice for a castle infiltration theme. It hits all the right beats. I just can't help myself but compare it to its predecessor, which I think I liked a little bit more. But this is still a worthy piece of music for this game's soundtrack, and gets the job done more than well enough. For those who played Breath of the Wild, playing through this section should feel pretty familiar. The castle was that game's finale, and when I covered that dungeon in its own video, I said that it was a great template for open-air dungeons. A template that I hoped at the time that Tears of the Kingdom would model its own dungeons after. The castle was winding and twisting on the inside, with tons of rooms and corridors that interconnected, while also massive and sprawling outside. It had tons of enemies as well as optional goodies and secrets, and could be tackled in a variety of ways. The castle excelled not just because it allowed players to engage with exactly how much of its contents they wanted to, but also because those contents were excellent. Tears of the Kingdom's version of Hyrule Castle starts by slicing the entire building in half. Literally. The bottom section, including the lockup, docks, dining hall, all the way up to the first gatehouse, are still on the surface, and are not counted as part of the dungeon according to the in-game dungeon map. The second gatehouse, library, Zelda's room, the sanctum, and all of the halls and exterior areas connecting them are what was lifted into the air, which makes up our new dungeon. What this means in terms of navigation is that a lot of the paths and hallways that connected certain areas are now destroyed, leaving either debris or massive drop-offs in their place. As mentioned before, Breath of the Wild's version of the castle allowed you to tackle the dungeon in any number of ways. You could rush for the sanctum, or take your time to explore every nook and cranny, or somewhere in between. I feel it is good that they changed things up here, so that we aren't exploring an identical structure yet again. However, they may have leaned a little too far in the other direction. The rooms are now laid out essentially in a giant horseshoe shape, with open space outside, so feasibly you can start at one end and work your way around to the other end. There are still plenty of optional goodies to find here, as well as great weapons, so I do still find myself incentivized to explore thoroughly. The big change though is that Breath of the Wild's version was a true open-air dungeon. The dungeon progression here is strictly linear, which I don't mind. Classic Zelda dungeons certainly tend to be that, and that's never been an issue for me. My problem is how they decided to present that linearity. That is to say, the dungeon progression is a big wild goose chase. Essentially, we are beckoned by Puppet Zelda to various locations throughout the dungeon, which get marked on our map. Once we reach that location, we get ambushed by enemies. Defeat the enemies, get baited to another area, rinse, repeat. Overall, the locations of these objectives roughly take us in a counterclockwise spiral around the dungeon, and then into the sanctum for the final boss. And then that's it. To be more specific about it, the dungeon goes something like this. Enter the castle and then head to the first marker, which is at the second gatehouse, and fight the monster forces. Head to the second marker, which is in the library, and fight the monster forces. Head to the staircase nearby for the third marker, fight the monster forces. Then the fourth marker in Zelda's room, the fifth in this nearby room, the sixth in this hallway, and finally the boss fight at the sanctum. Narratively, it kinda works. It makes total sense we'd have to head up to the castle now and learn the truth about Puppet Zelda, so that's alright. It's just that I don't believe for a second that Link is falling for it, because I'm certainly not. So I guess my headcanon is that he's just going along with it to see what happens, not because he really believes that this is the real Zelda, but more to confront whoever the imposter is. At least that's what I'm doing, so I'll just say that that's what Link is doing as well. Even still though, being strung around like this from room to room just doesn't feel very creative in terms of level design. Believe me, having to go through rooms in a set order is exactly what most classic dungeons do. I get that. I've written basically an encyclopedia's worth of scripts on that subject, but those old school dungeons at least present more interesting reasons for why you have to go through that order, usually by way of locking access to certain rooms. So yeah, there's minimal navigational challenge if you're familiar with the castle, and no puzzles to solve to reach new areas. Instead, the dungeon is a gauntlet, a series of combat challenges against monster forces spawning at these critical locations, with plenty of enemies in between to get through too. With that in mind, I can see why they split the castle in half then. The bottom half can still be explored freely for good loot, just like it was in Breath of the Wild, while the top half can be converted into a more linear dungeon setup. Gauntlet-style dungeons aren't bad either. I like the combat system in these games quite a lot, and this place has some of the best gear around, more weapons than I can usually carry. I just have a bit of a hard time getting past that sticking point of the navigation. Maybe it's because I was so familiar with the castle through my numerous Breath of the Wild playthroughs that going through here in such a curated fashion feels sort of out of place. It's hard to quantify what it is about it that just feels so off. Alright, with all of that said, once we've finished battling these monster forces and reached the sanctum, we can confront the dungeon boss. After a rather unsettling cutscene in which Puppet Zelda attempts to screw with us psychologically a bit, we are confronted by the dungeon boss. It's Phantom Ganon, and also Phantom Ganon, Phantom Ganon, and Phantom Ganon. Jokes aside, I love fighting this guy. He's just so creepy looking, and it's honestly cool to have this fight in the sanctum like this, especially in this illusory state of being pristine. Now, recycling bosses isn't isn't always the most engaging way to do things, but I actually enjoy this approach for this dungeon since they do mix it up a bit. While most encounters with Phantom Ganon are preceded by Gloom Spawn, that isn't the case this time around, so a little bit of the scare factor is replaced by regular old intimidation instead, hence the duplication. Odds are, by this point in the game, you've probably battled this guy at least a couple of times already out in the wild, so hopefully you know how to take him on. It is essentially a sword fight. I think if it were just a singular Phantom Ganon fight, then it would be quite the letdown, since he's basically just an overworld boss as well, so having him duplicate is absolutely the right choice, if you ask me. It turns this into a very real challenge, having to essentially split your focus among several different bosses. It's worth noting that there will be one specific phantom that spreads gloom along the floor, which will sap your health quite quickly if you don't deal with him, in addition to needing to juggle the rest of them. If we wanted to make this boss fight even harder, it could have been pretty cool to let loose some Gloom Spawn into the room too, or even perhaps pulling an Uno reverse and having the Phantom Ganons we defeat turn into Gloom Spawn. Actually, on second thought, perhaps the fight would get too chaotic at that point, so scratch that. That said, I appreciate just how fun this fight is. Phantom Ganon is always a welcome return. The battle is very different from the other 4 bosses that we've fought so far, and is also far more challenging. Maybe it's because there's a slight hesitation in his attacks, but I always struggle to pull off a flurry rush or parry against this guy. Aside from that, I don't actually have too much more to say about this boss battle. I like it a lot, but it isn't exactly breaking any new ground that warrants further discussion. Once he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, we'll get our heart container, a nice nugget of exposition, and we're left off to either further explore the castle or head back to Lookout Landing at our leisure. So that's the dungeon. Overall, the Crisis at Hyrule Castle is a fun little excursion. While it doesn't quite hit the same climactic highs of Breath of the Wild's foray into the castle, it also isn't trying to. That's not the point of this dungeon. This is no longer the game's finale. It's a slightly smaller scale dungeon that is here to break up the pacing between the initial set of 4 main dungeons and the lengthy quest leading into the next one. If your expectations were for something similar to Breath of the Wild, then I can certainly see this experience feeling jarring in a way. But taking this experience on its own merits, it does succeed in what it set out to do. So this is not exactly my favorite dungeon. In fact, I would rank it closer to the bottom of the list of dungeons in this game. I mean, not lower than the rather uninteresting Water Temple, but it's also not quite as exciting for me as the Wind or Lightning Temple either. That said, I like to try to be constructive with my criticisms, rather than just bashing things senselessly. So it's at this point that I would ask myself, how could we improve it? What's the fix here? Well, here's a few ideas. In many previous dungeons, I have said that having deliberately placed locks and keys would go a long way to making the dungeons feel more interesting. This time, I'm not sure that that is the case. Maybe it would, but maybe not. We could have all of the map markers spawn in at once, rather than one at a time, so that instead of being strung from one location to the next sequentially like this, we could tackle them in whichever order we'd prefer. We could remove the markers altogether and rely on the player's exploration to find out where to go, and let players use all the skills and tools at their disposal still. At that point though, I'd also argue that reducing the number of critical locations by about half would help too. There's 7 of these key locations, counting the Sanctum, and some of them are in hallways that you might not think to look in, or are tricky to spot the entrances to. So maybe keeping those in more key memorable locations like the Gatehouse Library and Zelda's room would be for the best. Those feel more interesting than the random hallway encounters, if you ask me. I still like the enemy quantity, so for those removed hallway encounters, keep the baddies there. Or you could have all 7 key locations still, but only require require the player to hit up 4 of them, and still in any order, before being able to go to the Sanctum for the boss fight. If we're removing the objective markers, that still feels fairly balanced. Otherwise, if that doesn't feel like enough, or we feel like we need that heavy-handed guidance, then yeah, we absolutely could rework some more of the structure to include some ascend puzzles and locked doors or whatnot. The castle has been ripped apart, so changing some of the geometry isn't off the table. In fact, they already do. I just think I'd have liked to see them take it a step further. I'd also love to have Link's abilities matter more here for progression, since the castle is pretty traversable by normal means. I get that the layout is a holdover from Breath of the Wild, back when flying machines and ascend didn't exist, but that doesn't mean we can't rework things for this game, right? We already split the castle in half. We could go a few steps further to make the terrain more treacherous, even if it were just removing some sections of floor to make the risk of falling out of the dungeon even more prevalent. Or perhaps even adding in some secret rooms that we never knew about in Breath of the Wild, but can now get into using Ascend. Think about the entrances to the Royal Hidden Passage down below in the castle grounds. These rooms existed in Breath of the Wild, but those entrances were hidden under statues that we couldn't interact with back then. So now, more context has been added to give new life to these areas. That's the sort of thing I would have liked to see more of here in the floating castle. So overall, I don't dislike this dungeon. It is quite enjoyable. There's a lot of fun to be had combing through these halls again and decimating these baddies, but it just feels like there is a lot of untapped potential here. I'd like to take a quick moment here to thank you for watching this video, and special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube as well as my supporters on Patreon. You guys make this all possible. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, and Stefan, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.